Well, we're in Exodus chapter 15 today. As I was preparing this message, I was remembering how having children is a wonderful way in which God can reveal the state of our hearts. By default, full disclosure, by default, I'm a pessimist. It's hard for me sometimes to see the positive side of things. It's one of the least things in my life that I like, and I'm being negative about that, but it is. I like to say that I'm actually not pessimistic, that I'm just a realist, or that I'm realistic, but I don't. It's simply not true. I have to work hard at being optimistic, especially when things are difficult and especially when things are challenging. And our youngest child, Jude, last week, when we were going to Blaine for lunch, so eloquently reminded me of that. Now, to give a little background, I grew up in South Minneapolis, and I lived in Mankato, lived in Louisville, Kentucky. I grew up with traffic all the time. That was just what I was used to. But as we were going down Highway 65, does it not seem like by the time you get to Ham Lake, everybody forgets how to drive except for you, right? That's how it was. We're driving along, everything's going smooth, and then all of a sudden, traffic hits a standstill. All these cars in front of me stop for what seems like no apparent reason. And so as I'm braking and I'm slightly going off onto the shoulder, I somehow hear myself saying, "What are you doing? Come on!" So guess what I heard for the next 10 to 15 minutes? Every single time I hit the brake. A little quiet voice behind me going, "Come on, what are you doing?" So I had to, say to him, you know what, Jude, we shouldn't talk like that. And I highly doubt that I'm alone in that. And the question that I asked is, why is it that when things go wrong, or that they don't go the way that we planned, we default into annoyance, or we default into complaining, or general negativity? It doesn't have to be external. It can be in our minds as well. And I think I found the answer and the reason and the solution in the book of Exodus, specifically in our chapters that we're going to be looking at this morning. Now, I'm going to lay out what I think that the main point of these three sections are, and then I'm going to break them down. I think the reason for our grumbling, our whining, and our complaining is that we don't fully know the Lord. And because we don't fully know the Lord, we don't trust Him as much as we should. But even when we find the reason there for our complaining, the solution is also there. The solution is to know God as uber generous, deeply concerned with us, and powerful enough to meet our needs and give us those things that are necessary, and to trust Him as such, fully trust Him. And there are two ways that I saw that in this passage here. The first is that we need to accept trying times as tests of faith. Just accept it. Accept trying times as tests of faith. In the church that we served at in Nebraska, there was one guy that was a member of our church, and he was a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and part of his job was to actually work with the Department of the Interior and study fish. And that's what his PhD was in, fishery, if that's the right word for it. He studied fish. And as a professor, he taught advanced degree students in fishery. And part of his work was research. And his research would have been a dream for some of us, because Kevin could fish in ways that are illegal for you and I to fish. He would get in his boat and he could set up a perimeter around his boat, push a button, send an electrical shock into the water by which all the fish would be paralyzed for a moment or two, rise to the surface, and then he would scoop them up, put them in his boat, study what he needed to study, and then he would put them back when they were back the way that they were. And as I thought about Kevin, I realized that, tough times, stressful times, those times sort of have a way of doing the exact same thing for us. That the shocks in life, whether they're big or whether they're small, have a tendency to bring to the surface those things that need attention in our lives, those things that might need study or change. Now, the Israelites had just experienced God's central act in the Old Testament. They had been enslaved in Egypt. They had been harshly treated. Yet the Lord passed over the Israelites in the judgment of death on Egypt's firstborns, and he led them through the Red Sea on dry land, while punishing the Egyptian army by enclosing the water on top of them. The Lord both saved and he delivered Israel from the hand of wicked oppressors in a completely miraculous way. Now, I don't know about you, but if we were to go to Lake Mille Lacs right now, or if we were to go up to Lake Superior, and the person that was our tour guide or our leader picked up a stick and raised up his hands and said a couple words, and the water just lifted up and opened up, and the land was dry, and you could walk across from Minnesota all the way to Wisconsin or Canada, I think I would probably say, that was awesome! And I wouldn't forget it very soon, because how often does that happen? Like, never. But maybe not, because I don't feel like I'm above putting myself in any better light than the Israelites here. The text says in 1522 that it wasn't but 3 days later, after the parting of the Red Sea, that the Israelites began to complain. Look with me in 1522 through 24. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Mora, they could not drink the water of Mora because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Mora. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" All right, it's easy to understand their complaint, right? They've been walking through the desert for 3 days. You need water to live. It's one of those things that's a necessity of life. You can probably only go 3 to 5 days without water before you actually dehydrate and potentially die. So I doubt many of us would blame the Israelites here for their contempt of what's going on. But notice that their complaint isn't about a lack of water. The complaint is about the taste of the water. They don't like the bitterness. And they've completely lost their perspective. They have forgotten that just 3 days ago, God had provided them a great salvation and deliverance. And they had failed to see what was right in front of them. All they could see was what their lives were experiencing: bitterness, distastefulness. Now, that might not seem like much for us in hindsight. We say, wow, 3 days? Really? Why? That was really quick for them to start complaining. But when we look at our own lives, how long does it take for you to lose perspective? How long does it take for you to get discouraged at work? How long does it take for you to get discouraged at home? Or get annoyed with the kids for their constant questions and unending demands, or stress over the finances, or to lose patience while you're driving, or to snap at your spouse, or to do these things that just so naturally seem to just boil up so quickly. For most of us, we'd be lucky if we made it to 3 days. Our perspective is a test of faith. And it's interesting here when you look at the progression of the tests here. It starts off somewhat easy. After all, they're not complaining about, again, not having water. It's just the taste. And it moves to something now a little bit more difficult. It moves to something that they need but aren't able to naturally get while they're in the desert. Look with me in chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. They set out from Elim, And all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died in the hand of the Lord, by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Now, I'm not sure if the Israelites here are being sarcastic or not in verse 3. But whatever the case, their attitude is pretty sad here. It's been 2.5 months since their deliverance, and they are saying that if they had the choice, they would much rather be back where they were than where they are now. They would rather work constantly for 7 days a week in the heat of the desert, making bricks, and if they screw up or don't do what they're supposed to do, they are beaten, whipped. They are willing to go back and have the possibility that Pharaoh will kill one of their family members, and saying that where they are now is worse than they were in Egypt. That seems ridiculous, doesn't it? But yet, you and I are no different than they are. One of the chief characteristics of bitterness and discontent and possessing a complaining spirit is that we don't just wish for a better circumstance, but that we want unrealistic, idealistic, or illogical circumstances or outcomes. Many in our culture have this idealized view that life would be so much better if they just had more money. And so when the paychecks barely cover the bills, there are many of us who think, well, maybe I'll just throw $5, $10, $15 into the lottery and see if maybe I can increase my winnings, a few bucks, or if it's a Powerball that's worth many millions, maybe I have the chance to improve my circumstances here. To think that you have a chance when the odds, some 5 million to 1 or even worse than that, is completely ridiculous. And what happens then? That you have an idealized fantasy that creates a cycle by which you spend more money into something like that, and you keep losing more when that money that you're giving away could be going back into paying the bills, food, groceries. Or maybe you've had a long day at work, and you think, golly, I need to go home and I have to have a drink. No, I'm not saying that drinking is good or bad. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that when we use drinking as a reward for endurance for something, we've lost our perspective. I've known many women who have been in abusive relationships, gotten out of them, and tragically go back into those relationships because, at least in that relationship, at least the bills are paid. At least I have a roof over my head. At least I have food on my table. At least I have a place to sleep. And I think if I took an anonymous survey, I wonder how many of us would say that when life gets tough, their first inclination isn't to flee to God, it is to remember with fondness what life was like before we had God and want to return to those certain aspects of that life. Or believe that life would be totally better than the one that He has given us. And we strive for an unrealistic idealism. Well, notice how the progression of testing deepens further here when we look at chapter 17. Look with me in verses 1 through 4 of 17. And all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commander of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted for water. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." Okay, now we are seeing the true test of faith here. This time it isn't whether the water tastes good. It's that there is no water at all. They're absolutely forced to make a decision. Are they going to trust that God is leading them through Moses, or are they going to give in to despair? This is a total test of faith. And what is their response? A pseudo-nihilistic view of life. That this is pointless and this is hard. And they, like us, far too often choose despair rather than faith. Notice they don't make a motion to return to Egypt because they're too far out. If they go back towards Egypt, they're a month and a half out. They go back, they're going to die in 2 or 3 days without water. They stay there, they are going to die without water. They believe that faith is of no value versus the elements, and the best thing that they can do right now is make the one that is responsible for their problems miserable. So they blame Moses. And Moses is absolutely beside himself. But notice how this episode at Massah is different than the other two. Whereas before they were generally complaining about their circumstances and their unbelief is sort of underneath the surface. In chapter 17, the gloves are off. Look again at verse 2. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" So here they are in the wilderness. God is testing them to see where their heart is, to see where their faith is. And yet in their mind, they see this as an opportunity to challenge and question the goodness of God. And how often when we're on our last rope, when it seems like all hope is gone, we can't take anymore, we're about to throw in the towel, that we forget that what we are experiencing right now is an opportunity to display faith. Sure, the circumstance is difficult. Sure, it seems impossible. But God has been faithful to his people throughout all generations. And we either forget it, we either deny it, or we ignore it. And we look at it as God, not as God lovingly helping us to purify our faith. Rather, we look at it as if God was a tyrant. We want to believe that God is tempting us rather than trying us. Look what James writes in James chapter 1. In James chapter 1, it says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, 'I'm being tempted by God.' For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire." So we don't want to believe that God would put us through difficult times. We don't want to believe that God would ask us to give up a lifestyle. We don't want to believe that God would want to shock the waters of our lives so that those things that need attention would come to the surface. And so we grumble and we complain. And the source for that grumbling is a heart that is bent against God. So how do we fight this? I think first is that we look at James chapter 1 in verses 2 and 3. And this is what James writes: "Count it all joy, my brothers, Count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. That's perseverance, it's endurance. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So take joy when God shocks the water, that He would care to bring about those things in your heart that need refining, and trust Him in His word. So the first thing that we need to do is accept the trying times as tests of faith. And the second thing that we need to do is trust God to provide for your needs. Trust God to be the provider of your needs. I said before that I'm a naturally pessimistic person, and I've gotten better over the years, but it's not because I've come up with a practical how-to guide, though I've tried. Almost every day I'm reminded of that mindset when I go into my closet. See, my wife has a great sense of humor, and one day she realized that I was in a bad mood for a string of time. And so I came home one day, and there was a little package on her bed or on her counter or something, and it opened up, and I should have brought it today. It's a T-shirt of the dwarf Grumpy. And so the deal was that when I was in a bad mood, I was to come home and put on the shirt so that when she would come and see me with the shirt on, that she would know that I'm not in the best mood. Naturally, it was a lighthearted gesture, and we still get a kick out of it, but it didn't get me out of my ruts. So at one point, I actually kept a bracelet on my wrist that I tried to go. The deal was that if I complained once in the day, I would take off the bracelet and put it on the other hand, and the goal was to keep it on one wrist for a week at least. I don't even think I lasted a few hours, and I ended up giving up after a couple of days. So I have not found the catch-all for anybody, but I have found the solution that seems to be effective. And it's exactly what God is doing for the Israelites here. It is to first have a healthy assessment of my heart, and then to have a firm trust in God's provision and care. And the question that God asks me daily in my attitude is the same question that He asks you every day. Do you trust me? Do you trust me? You might not think that your complaining or grumbling or bitterness or whatever you want to say is not a big deal. But this passage here tells us that these heart attitudes are a very big deal, because what they are saying is that at the root of these things, we believe that God is not able to provide. We believe that God is not caring. We believe that God is holding back from us. We believe that He has not given us what we think we need. These are fundamental rejections of God. So how does God help individuals break us through these intense emotions? He shows His faithfulness, and He shows His provision through daily needs and spiritual needs. Look at how He provides for our daily needs. Hunger and thirst were a very real problem for people in the ancient Near East, and they still are in third world countries today. But for the Israelites, it was more so. They're traveling through the desert. And when they come to Mora, it almost seems like a cruel joke that they come to what amounted to an oasis. Their tongues are desiring water. And again, it shows the description of their hearts. They're bitter. But how does God respond? Oh, you bitter, ungrateful people. I'm just going, no, He doesn't. He provides for them. Look in chapter 15, verses 25 through 27. And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. The Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there He tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in His eyes, and give ear to His commandments, and keep all of His statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. Then they came to Elim, and there were 12 springs of water, 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. So notice here that God is not taking lemons and making lemonade. He is completely changing their situation. He is making their water sweet. And friends, let me tell you that when life gets bitter, God is always sweet. He totally changes the situation. And let me rephrase that. He might not change the situation, but your perspective will change. And when your perspective changes, so does everything else. Look at Psalm 34, verses 8 through 10. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Oh, fear the Lord, you his saints. Those who fear him have no lack. So when the Israelites didn't turn to the Lord to provide nutritional sustenance, look at chapter 16, let's go 4 to 15. The Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to, get this, rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day that I might test them, whether they'll walk in my law or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people, at evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us? And Moses said, when the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, and you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked down toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in a cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them at twilight, you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine, flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. And when the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is bread that the Lord has given you to eat. So they're in the desert. They're completely hopeless and helpless. You can't grow wheat. There's no decent animals out there in order for them to slaughter and to cook. Not that there would be enough anyway. It was there that the Israelites see the goodness of God. Look at quail in the desert. Now, why would that be significant? It would be significant because quail is an animal that is very easy to clean and to dress right there in a field, not needing a knife, not needing anything else. It's kind of gross. You just clip off the wings, clip off the feet, do a little something with the head, tear off the feathers, and it's ready to eat. It's one of those quick recipes that they could have. They were limited on resources, and they're able to have it there. Manna comes down from heaven. What is manna? It's this weird bread. In fact, literally, the word manna means, what is it? Because they can't describe it. But faithfully, every day for 6 days, it comes in the morning. Not only to show his faithfulness, but to test them. Are you going to trust me? God is saying, not only did I deliver you from oppressors, but I will also love you and take care of you. Do you believe it? What about you? Have you seen the deliverance of the Lord? Have you seen your need for him to redeem you from your sin? If not, we'll see it here in a moment. But if you have, how do you feel about him right now? Do you truly believe that God will take care of you? That he is powerful enough and caring enough, that he knows what is best for you? That in his provision and those things that he even withholds from us are what's best. Do you see these things and have faith? Or do you complain? Perhaps the most serious test in this is chapter 7 when there's no water. They're sitting. I said they're sitting ducks, and then I think there's no water out there. You can't be a sitting duck. There's nothing that they can do except complain and wait for death. Now, many of us don't understand this because we've never truly felt real thirst. We have faucets and water can come out. We've lived in a place where we've had to boil water before, but that was only for a few days. Now, look with me in chapter 17, verses 4 through 6. Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I'll stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and the water will come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us?" Now, I'm not sure if I don't know for those of you that are travelers and if it's this way throughout a lot of states, but when we lived in Kentucky, it was pretty cool because they had roads that went through rock piles that they blasted out that you could drive through. And if you looked on the sides carefully, you could see water dripping out of these rocks. And in the winter, it was really cool because it would actually freeze and it would look like mini frozen waterfalls that were coming out of these rocks. So water does indeed come out of rocks, but probably not enough to quench the thirst of 1 million people and livestock. This is the desert. And yet here in the midst of absolute desperation, God has water pour out from this rock to show his care, to test them. Now, I'm not sure what you are going through right now. You may be in your Massah and your Meribah moment right now, moments when you're at your end, no resources, no friends to turn to, nothing left, yet God asks you to trust him. And he may crack open floods for you, or he may keep you dry and parched. But if he does, you're in a good place. Because Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." For what? They shall be satisfied. Right? That the Lord will be our satisfaction. And I'm convinced that in those trying times, our heart cry is not, "As the deer panteth for water, so my soul pants for you," but rather the song of our hearts is in verse 7. Is the Lord among us or not? That is the root of all of our complaints. Is the Lord among us? And the answer is what? Yes. The Lord is among us. He is among us in the person of Jesus Christ. In John chapter 6, in verses 1 through 15, there's one occasion where Jesus is feeding 5,000 people with loaves and fish. Get this, in a wilderness. And it wasn't hard for them to see the overtones of what's happening here. And they think that Jesus is another Moses who's going to feed them forever. But Jesus tells them that he is not to be their eternal chef. But rather, in 6:35, he says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall never hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." Jesus is the embodiment of what God was doing in Exodus chapters 15 through 17. Jesus satisfies us in a way that goes beyond provisions of daily bread. Jesus forgives our sins, and he leads us into a new kind of life. And how do his hearers respond? Look in John 6:41. The Jews grumbled about him because he said, "I am the bread." But how does Jesus respond? "I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, pointing at himself, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. This powerful image changes everything. How you view your personal problems. It changes how you view your physical illnesses. It changes how you view your tight money. It changes how you view past errors, shame, regret. And further, when our lives are parched dry, when they're lackluster, lacking in purpose or direction, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul writes, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that flowed from them, and the rock was who? Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased. They were overthrown in the wilderness. So, the incident at Massah here was a pointer to Jesus Christ. And the Bible tells us, and we know experientially, that we are sinners. We've done, said, and thought things that are not pleasing to God. And the just outcome is that we spiritually die in the wilderness that we have chosen. Yet Christ on the cross was the rock that was struck for us, broken. And as a result, forgiveness, benevolence, and freedom flowed from him to his people. Jesus said in John 7:38, whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, rivers of flowing water will flow from him. When we trust in Jesus, those difficult and dry seasons not only seem more tolerable, but they are now purposeful. Your life can completely change through Jesus Christ. Are you willing to put your faith in him fully today? You know, there is a really poisonous fish called a fugu. It is a Japanese fish, and they say that it is so poisonous that some experts say that it is more toxic than cyanide from a fish. Yet, it's a delicacy in Japan. It's not a fish that you can just catch clean and throw into the fryer. In fact, the smallest mistake in your preparation of this fish can be fatal. So in Japan, they actually have a regulation that only highly trained and licensed chefs can cook this dish. And it goes without saying that if you're going to eat fugu, you have to have an awful lot of trust in the chef on what you're about to eat. Friends, our sin is fugu. And yet we play around with it like it's absolutely nothing. It has led us into a spiritual wilderness, and it will kill us. The only survival is to allow not just any old sous chef, but the sous chef to take care of it for us. And in Christ Jesus, he has taken all the poison of our sin, placed it on Jesus, so that we can have a feast of faith with Christ in the midst of a wilderness. But the question is, will you trust him? Will you see him as the providing God? Would you bow with me? Heavenly Father, you ask us to trust you. You ask us to have faith in you. And Lord, let's be honest, Lord, there are some times, a lot of times,